and enjoy the next talk, which happens to be Paul Gustafson. So Paul joins us all the way from the US West Coast, so welcome. You got to be welcome for Paul. So Paul is the CEO of Expert Support, and they are a professional services firm that focus on communication. Paul is going to share lessons drawn from a program to improve open source docs from 170 projects on the Cloud Native Computing Foundation. It's going to be a program about what works and what doesn't work as well. So it should be a pretty interesting talk. So back in San Fran, Paul maintains a list of live music venues in the Bay Area from, and tries to see as many bands as he possibly can during his time there. He's also a massive fan of blues, and he's had the opportunity to tour the original studio in Chicago, where Willie Dixon, Muddy Waters, and Buddy Guy recorded their classics, and where Chuck Berry recorded Johnny B. Good. And also where Ed and James recorded At Last. It must have been amazing. Folks, please give a big Aussie welcome, Paul Gustafson.
So I'm Paul Gustafson. I don't know any of you. So thanks for inviting me to speak. I'll give you a quick overview of what we're going to cover here in the next 20 minutes. Let me just set my timer. Here we are. I'm going to make some introductions, not about just me and my company, but the clients that we're working with on this project, the challenge that's presented to us, the approach we're taking, some lessons, and how we're hopefully improving things, and then what we expect to do next and some implications of that, which hopefully some people in the room here will be able to help us with and find value in. So a bit about me, because it's always about me. I'm a Silicon Valley survivor. These are some of the places I've worked. Always in engineering, kind of working with sales and marketing, or vice versa, in sales and marketing, working with the guys in engineering. I landed at Technology, which was an AI startup back in the 80s. And one of the people that I met there actually started Expert Support, where I rejoined them about 6 years ago. I've been on the staff of Expert Support. I've been a client of Expert Support. It's a company I'm very familiar with. And we do software docs mostly for a lot of Silicon Valley companies, big, medium, and small. And we tackle the oddball documentation project too. We have a reputation for having a lot of good writers. So our little web form gets filled out by people looking for someone to help them with documentation, usually calling us after a bad experience working with a writer, or there's not enough time to get done what they need, so they need help figuring it out. So we're kind of the ambulatory crew for a lot of documentation projects. And I won't spend any of the time telling stories about where I've worked or what we've done lately, because I want to get to the next of it. So the clients in this particular improving documentation scale project is the Linux Foundation. I actually met a guy that, and Cloud Native Computing Foundation is actually the cloud native part of the Linux Foundation. And I met a developer advocate that works for CNCF at the Portland Write the Docs. So this project that we're going to be talking about started earlier this year at that conference. So it's a real pleasure to be describing it here after several months of getting started. The challenge is the Cloud Native Computing Foundation has 170 projects. And when I say a project, this is an open source product that is trying to go from what they call an incubating or a sandbox stage to an incubation stage to a graduated stage. And CNCF tries to shepherd those projects along. One of the projects that they're best known for is Kubernetes, right? Began as a CNCF kind of open source project. So if you're familiar with that, it's an open source scalable infrastructure software technology. And there's lots of different kinds of projects and that do just about every kind of thing you can imagine in the cloud native context. If you want to learn more about that or this list of, I couldn't even fit them all on one browser window, so I had to take 2 screenshots to give you a sense of how many projects there are. And the one thing that they all share in common is they all need help with documentation. They're a nonprofit, so they don't have a lot of cash, and the people working on the projects, who are developers mostly, don't have a lot of time to help with documentation. They do the best they can, but they're very busy folks, and there are very, very few writers supporting documentation for the vast majority of these projects. So that's what we got hired to help with. And when we got there, we renamed a program that they were already working on. And this is the approach that we're taking now. It's called the CNCF Documentation Assistance Program. And it starts with basic training, not necessarily for writers, but for the engineers working in the community. It's things like, we're not talking about taking someone from 0 to 100 miles an hour in terms of being a good tech writer. We're trying to help them understand why they should know how to spell documentation. and what it is, and what that means, and how to work with a writer, and what's the basic set of things that you need to be effective in explaining this incredible software that your open source project is trying to create. So we asked people that we're supporting to kind of take this training. When we started, it didn't exist, but it does now, because we created it. And there's these 2 classes now. If you go to the Linux Foundation training site and do a search for them, you'll find it. And they're free. So you might be able to get your engineers that you work with, if this is a challenge for you, if someone's not willing to spend a few hours learning the basics, I'm sorry, it's going to be real hard for us to help. But if you can at least know why you need documentation and how to engage and what you need to do to be effective, then at least you're at a place where we can now begin to help you. Beyond that, we do something that we call a documentation analysis, which is just we try to figure out what they have and what they don't have, and then we make recommendations about where to start, and then we open issues for the community to address, and we're actually closing some of these issues. If you're not familiar with open source projects, the term issues here is it's a term of art. It's essentially what a writer would call an assignment. It's typically used for, if someone's using a piece of software and it doesn't work, there's a bug, they'll open an issue for someone on the team to address it. The same parlance applies to documentation in this context. Lessons learned. When we got there, this program was called, the first step was, first of all, the training didn't exist, so we created that. And the first step was called a documentation assessment. And so we jumped in and we just started doing the assessment for a couple of the projects that we're working with. And the template that they had built had a very good, from our perspective, rubric for kind of the things that you needed and how to evaluate what you had and how good was it and what could what did you need to improve. And from a writer perspective, it's the most obvious thing to go do. But the problem with it is that it alienated people. I remember sitting in a web meeting with one of the projects that we were working with. And we're talking with the lead maintainer of a particular project. And you could tell he was just didn't want to be in the meeting with us, talking about the results of our assessment. And he said, look, because I know I want to make this successful, but you should know, nobody wants a report card. These teams know that the documentation that they have is inadequate. We need to go figure out where to help and what needs to be done and how good what they have is, and understand kind of what can be done to improve it. But the first step shouldn't be a 1 to 5 rating for what they've done so far with limited resources and not very much experience in the space. So the result was we alienated some people and we had to dig out of a relationship hole. And I think this is a lesson for writers of every ilk when you're working with your stakeholders. to try to find something other than a report card to begin your engagement. So the first thing, after this experience, we renamed the assessment to the analysis phase. And we've also taken a technique that we've used at expert support for many years in these engagements. That is a quick win. Anytime you're working with someone new, especially someone who's behind or is coming to you for help late in the game, it's often the case that they've had a bad experience, right? Where they worked with someone who couldn't get something done in time, and now there's even less time to work on. And so we always try to find something that's obvious and relatively easy, and just get that done, right? Because it turns out people that work on these projects want to work with other people who get stuff done. And showing up and doing a bunch of analysis and showing up with a report card as the first step, maybe not the best first step to take. So which task do you do? Well, it varies by project, but it's always something that looks pretty obvious. It's something that there's general consensus around and non-controversial, and also something that will make a big difference right away. And that does establish that early credibility. Now, the other thing that we've done is we've extended the process now to include things that were out of scope when we began. One thing is very clear user role definitions. Open source projects are complicated because there are end users, there are IT people that install and maintain the software, there are developers who are trying to use the APIs of the product itself, and then there are contributors and maintainers that are actually working on the software that is the whole reason we're having this conversation. And in every instance, there hasn't been a clear definition or distinction between those roles. And so, as a result, there's good documentation, but it's kind of all over the place. It's in the spec, it's in the blog, it's in a tech overview, it's in sometimes it's in the comments in the code, right? It can kind of be all over the place. It hasn't been drawn together into a documentation set which looks obvious to a tech writer. But if you're an engineer, you may never think to actually organize it into a TOC or into a documentation suite. So that's an excellent first place to start sometimes, is just proposing a new organization. You can't really do that until you know who the users are and what tasks each of those users types are trying to accomplish, right? Those things are important because without them, it's difficult to create an issue, remember, writing assignment, for a volunteer that's bite-sized. People who want to help don't have months or weeks to contribute things. They got a few days. Hey, I got, every Thursday for the next 2 weeks I'm free. I could do something, right? So we need to have assignments where the user role is clear and where to put the output of the writing. If something's missing, where does it go into this hierarchy? If you don't have that, all of a sudden you're faced with a bigger problem, which is, I don't know how to organize this. I don't know where stuff goes. But our hope is that with clear user role definitions and clear documentation organizational structure, we'll be able to create bite-sized writing assignments, which are ideal, in our hope, for more junior technical writers to build portfolios. So what I do for a living is I put writers to work. We're a services business. I have people on my team. We have people that apply that would like to think about becoming a tech writer, but they don't have a portfolio. And one of the things that our clients almost always ask for is they want to see things that the writer has done before they decide to hire us and the writer to get that work done. So these projects, we think, will be bite-sized enough that as someone who's less far along and less experienced, we'll be able to jump in and help us with these projects over time. And from there, just looking ahead is, we've started with 4 projects. We've kind of just presented some recommendations to the first one. We're about to do the second one. The third one's in progress. The fourth one's now identified. There are 70 plus, so that's only 166 more to go. But everything that we're doing, from the methodology to the analysis, is out in the open. So if any of you would like to pick a project and help, you can find the documentation on the methodologies that we're using and the templates that we're doing and the work that we've done so far up on their website. Because we are looking to build a documentation community to sit alongside the open source software developer community to actually, kind of get this work done. And the last point I'd like to make is that we think that methodology is crucial, not just for cloud native and then Linux, but generally speaking, if we take a step back from software for a second and we think about the world that we live in, it's getting more complicated every day, right? And guess what? We're not going back. So the problems that we face as a society, as a world, going forward, are going to be more and more complex over time. And the solutions to those problems, we just heard about AI, that's a very complicated solution to many more problems. But the solutions are going to be inherently complicated. And so far, we have a real challenge in getting complex solutions adopted, primarily because people don't get it, right? And experts and people that create solutions get frustrated when those solutions aren't adopted because people don't get it. So who's going to solve that problem? It's going to be the people in this room, right? It's going to be people who are not intimidated by complexity and care about explaining it to others who need to be able to get it, right? And the good news is we have lots of examples in this blog post I wrote a few years ago about problems that we've solved once people get it. My favorite is the hole in the ozone, right? Now you think about that problem, that is a complicated problem. You're talking about organic chemistry and the stratosphere and radiation coming from the sun that can give you a fatal disease on your skin. When I was in high school, I remember reading about the hole in the ozone. By now, we were all going to be living underground, right? Because it was going to be too dangerous to be outside. But as soon as that problem got described, it was like, oh wait, I got to use a roll-on instead of a spray deodorant? Okay, I can do that. Or maybe gel instead of hairspray, or put a different fluid in my car air conditioner. All of a sudden, our planet, millions of little decisions got changed in a different way. Now that hole's actually beginning to get smaller, right? And there are lots of other examples. So coming up with systems that we can use to explain technology in a scalable way is crucial. And our hope is that the methodology that we're beginning to design for the Cloud Native Computing Foundation can not only apply to the Cloud Native Computing Foundation, but also Linux, but also OpenStack and Mozilla and every other kind of open source software community you can think of. And software is not a bad place to start, because software, if you haven't noticed, every company now is a software company. And that's where most of the technology, most of the complexity really lives. So my last slide is for the Q&A that we should leave up. If you want these links, you can go find them on the expert support homepage. There's a blog post up with a little article about this talk at expertsupport.com. And that's what I got.
All right, Paul, thank you so much for talking to us about that today. There's a fair few links up there at the moment too, which thank you for leaving those up. I'm just wondering, does anyone have any questions about what they've seen today? There's a few actually. So Lisa's question is a bit of a good one there. So where's the division between getting the structure set up and just doing the work? How do you balance that? Would that summarize it? Yeah.
How do you do both at the same time?
It's a great question, and it really tests every engagement that we have at expert support, because when we get a new client, we're just another tech writing firm, and oftentimes we're hired after something went wrong, either with someone that they hired or another vendor, or there's some issue. And so we have to have two tracks, right? We have to come up to speed very quickly on whatever it is that we're working on, which we've never looked at before. And we also have to build credibility with our client. So part of that is on me when we are setting up the work. We try to set the expectation for whatever the first project is, that most of the work is going to get done in the last third of the engagement, right? Because we have to learn a lot. We have to learn about whatever systems they're using, whatever tools there are. If all that stuff was documented and well set up, they wouldn't be hiring us, right? So by definition, it's kind of fouled up, and they often don't know how or why. But we set that, it's okay, we've done this before, right? And we're always confident that we can make a difference. And we can usually find something that we can deliver pretty quickly that can get us the credibility that we need to keep going, right? So that's what that, choose wisely graphic was about.
Right, good question. Thank you for that question. That's great. So that was an interesting question about tooling across those 170 projects. Is there alignment, or do you let them go, whatever tool's right for you, you use that tool to do the documentation? How do you find a balance there?
Yeah, it's a great question. There's a lot to say. That could have been a whole talk about tools, right? Here's what we say. We lead with, use whatever tools you want. We've seen great documentation built with terrible tools. And we found really terrible documentation with terrific tools. So in fact, there's another blog post you can find on the site that the title of it is, "It's Not About the Tool." But that said, CNCF, I think, has kind of a set of recommendations, and I'm trying to recall exactly what they are. Hugo is one of the things that they've talked about an awful lot. So I think the organization would probably like to see more consistency across those projects, but it's the project teams that are doing the work, so they're going to ultimately decide which tools. And like I said, at the end of the day, we can learn a new tool faster than often the effort that's going to be required to migrate from whatever tool they happen to be using into a new space. Right? And like I said, it's about what you write into the tool. Matters a lot more than which tool you're using to actually put it into the system.
It's all about the words, isn't it, really? It's all about the tools. Although I do seem to remember that there was a previous Write the Docs presentation where they said, if you are going to select a tool, make sure it's one your developers know the framework for, because that will actually really help them move forward fast, right?
I think that's really good advice, and I also think that moving to the Docs as Code model, what you're really doing is adopting the workflow and the methodologies and the tools of your developer team, right? And anything that can get you kind of on the team is important, right? Because it's those people that you're going to depend on to explain the stuff that's not obvious and to answer your questions, but then also make sure that the way you've explained them, whatever those topics are, you need review and feedback on the work that they do in order to get it right. And cultivating those relationships with the people on the team is really at the heart of what this work is.
I think there was a question over here. Was it you, Sarah? So Sarah's question was about new person wanting to get involved in their community across those 170 different communities. How does that onboarding process go? Was it an onboarding question?
Yeah.
How practical is it? Yeah.
Oftentimes it's impractical, right? Many of the people that we're talking to about helping are already members of the community, kind of already up the learning curve, but aren't professional writers. People that are providing consulting services in the space or are working with customers to extend the tool in certain ways where they need the documentation to be better to get done what they need, but they're not writers, right? But they want to help with documentation. That said, I do hope that we'll be able to find some issues that are appropriate for people that may know nothing about the projects that we're getting started with. That's certainly been the case for us. We're not a open source software company. We are, every new project that we get involved with is something completely new. So, I'm blessed with a team of pretty senior people so that, they're not new to software or this kind of work. But we're also finding that people that want to help us don't have the skill set necessarily that they can come in and help us with. So that's why the mentorship, CNCF has a mentoring program that historically has been kind of aimed at people being contributors to the project. And we're having some conversation with them about trying to extend that to include people that want to help with documentation too.
Great question. My time for just a couple. A question about have you talked to the Good Dogs Project about the work you're doing here?
We haven't started that conversation yet, but you're absolutely right. I'm very familiar with the Good Docs work, and I do think there's some collaboration that we should be doing.
I'm missing anyone else from the crowd. So about the training that you've actually got there, is there anything interesting? Have you received feedback about anything interesting in those courses that have surprised you? Did I get that question right there?
Yeah, I guess you mentioned like you're not taking someone from 0 to 100. You're just kind of getting them started. And I wonder, we are probably blind perhaps to some of like a simple thing that maybe is interesting to someone new, as opposed to this like the full idea.
It's a great question in terms of, I think the honest answer is those courses shipped day before yesterday. So what we have now is training based on input that we got from CNCF and their experience. And, frankly, it's training that expert support had built for some of our clients. So we repurposed a lot of the content that we've created over the last 30 years into those two courses. But it's really designed, it's really intended to help project teams. As writers, we get paid to have empathy with the user and to try to be the proxy for the user and kind of understanding what tasks they're trying to do and work with the engineers to figure out how to go do those tasks. But we often do, I think we underestimate how much context we carry around in our own selves. We criticize the engineers like, oh, they don't get it, right? Because they're not documentation people. But who owns that problem? We do, right? So the training is really designed to help people that aren't professional communication people to understand the benefits of this. And frankly, one thing that all of these projects have in common is they're wanting to expand their adoption and grow their community. And if you have really bad documentation, it impedes adoption. So helping them understand how they can fix it is going to help them achieve kind of their goals that they have for the project. At least that's our hope.
That's right. Well, unfortunately, that question and answer is run very fast, and we're out of time, folks. So if you've got any follow-up questions for Paul, do grab him in the break and ask. I'm sure he'll be happy to help. But in the meantime, please thank Paul Gustafson.